We will now begin the fifth lecture on the books of Samuel. We will begin with 1 Samuel chapter 12. The title of chapter 12 is Samuel's Rebuke. Let's look at the main points. First, Samuel explains himself, verses 1 through 5. Second, Samuel says that God is personally in control over the history of Israel, verses 6 through 12. Third, rebuke for asking for a king and God's punishment, verses 13 through 18. Fourth, warning about the future and hope, verses 19 through 25. Read verses 1 through 2. Samuel said to all Israel, I have listened to everything you said to me and have set a king over you. Now you have a king as your leader. As for me, I am old and gray, and my sons are here with you. I have been your leader from my youth until this day. The Israelites asked Samuel to give them a king. Samuel made Saul king according to God's command. Verse 3. Here I stand. Testify against me in the presence of the Lord and his anointed. Whose ox have I taken? Whose donkey have I taken? Whom have I cheated? Whom have I oppressed? From whose hand have I accepted a bribe to make me shut my eyes? If I have done any of these things, I will make it right. Samuel explained himself before God and before the king. Samuel was faithful in his works for God as a prophet and a judge. First, the prophet Samuel never took anyone else's ox. Second, Samuel never cheated or oppressed anyone. Third, Samuel never received bribes. The people acknowledged these facts. This showed Samuel's faith. Samuel was faithful before God and just before the people. Samuel did not cheat the people. Samuel did not oppress the people. He did not receive bribes. Therefore, the prophet Samuel was an upright servant before God and before people. We church leaders must be faithful in all ways and be upright. Verse 6. Then Samuel said to the people, It is the Lord who appointed Moses and Aaron and brought your forefathers up out of Egypt. The prophet Samuel explained God's works in the history of Israel. God appointed Moses and Aaron and brought the Israelites out of Egypt. Verse 9. But they forgot the Lord their God, so he sold them into the hand of Sisera, the commander of the army of Hazor, and into the hands of the Philistines and the king of Moab, who fought against them. The Israelites served idols and forgot God. Thus God sent the Israelites into the hand of Sisera. God also sent them into the hands of the Philistines. God also sent them into the hands of the king of Moab. Judges chapter 4 verses 1 through 3, Judges chapter 3 verse 31, Judges chapter 3 verses 12 through 14. In this way, when the Israelites sinned, God punished them by sending them into the hands of foreign nations. Verse 11. Then the Lord sent Jerubbaal, Barak, Jephthah and Samuel, and he delivered you from the hands of your enemies on every side, so that you lived securely. Jerubbaal indicated Gideon. Judges chapter 7 verses 19 through 25. God allowed the people to defeat the Midianites through Gideon. Barak is also known as Bedan. Judges chapter 4 verses 12 through 16. God allowed the Israelites to defeat Sisera through Barak. Next, there is a man named Jephthah. Judges chapter 11. God allowed them to gain victory over the Ammonites through Jephthah. In these ways, God raised up great servants in each generation to save the Israelites. God delivered the Israelites from Egypt. God allowed the Israelites to live in the land of Canaan. Then God raised up leaders while they were in Canaan to lead the Israelites. God directly ruled Israel as their king. However, the Israelites started to ask for a man to be named king. The Israelites did not want God to rule over them, but a man to rule over them as king. Hence, God rebuked the Israelites through the prophet Samuel. Verse 13. Now here is the king you have chosen, the one you asked for. See, the Lord has set a king over you. It was wrong of the Israelites to ask for a king. It was the second best plan for the Israelites to serve man as king than God. The Israelites did not want God to rule over them, so God wanted to rule over them through a king. God chose Saul as king. Now the people were to obey the king's orders. That meant that they were to revere the Lord and serve the king well. God told the people to serve God through the king. We must not disobey God's commands. Verse 15. But if you do not obey the Lord, and if you rebel against his commands, his hand will be against you as it was against your fathers. God gave the people a king, and if the people did not obey God, God would punish them. Verse 16. Now then, stand still and see this great thing the Lord is about to do before your eyes. God rebuked the people for asking for a king. As a sign, God sent thunder and rain. God showed the people that it was a great sin for the people to ask for a king. The Israelites feared God because of the sudden thunder and rain. Verse 19. The people all said to Samuel, Pray to the Lord your God for your servants, so that we do not die. For we have added to all our other sins the evil of asking for a king. The Israelites asked the prophet Samuel to pray for them. In verse 20, the prophet Samuel said, Serve the Lord with all your heart. Serve the Lord with all your heart. Do not turn away after useless idols. Then God would not reject the Israelites, but would save them. Today we too must receive God's rule. We must be ruled by God. Verse 22. For the sake of his great name, the Lord will not reject his people, because the Lord was pleased to make you his own. God did not reject the Israelites for the sake of his great name. God was pleased when the people turned from their sins and repented. Now the people needed to serve God with all their hearts. They needed to throw away idols. When they did so, God would not reject the Israelites for the sake of his name and glory. Verse 23. As for me, far be it from me that I should sin against the Lord by failing to pray for you, and I will teach you the way that is good and right. The prophet Samuel was a man of prayer. As a prophet, Samuel always prayed for the Israelites. Samuel's mother, Hannah, was also a woman of prayer. Hannah made a vow and prayed to God, and she gave birth to Samuel. The prophet Samuel took after his mother and became a man of prayer. It says here that it is a sin to fail to pray. We must pray without ceasing. We must choose times of prayer in the early mornings and pray diligently. We pastors must always pray for the believers. Believers must also pray for the pastors. Pastors and believers must pray for each other. Verse 23. As for me, far be it from me that I should sin against the Lord by failing to pray for you, and I will teach you the way that is good and right. It says, I will teach you the way that is good and right. Pastors must properly teach God's Word. Pastors must first pray and understand the truth, and they must share spiritual bread with their flock. Verse 24. But be sure to fear the Lord and serve him faithfully with all your heart. Consider what great things he has done for you. The people were to remember the great things the Lord did for them. God did great things for us. We must always remember them in our hearts. We must fear God and serve God faithfully with all our hearts. How did God save us in the past? What grace did God pour out onto us? For example, God delivered the Israelites out of Egypt. God also led the Israelites through the wilderness. God allowed the Israelites to settle in the land of Canaan. All these were God's great works. Remember God's work of salvation in your life. We will continue with 1 Samuel chapter 13. The title is The Philistines Invade. Let's look at the main points. First, Jonathan attacks the Philistine outpost, verses 1 through 4. Second, the Philistines invade, verses 5 through 7. Third, Samuel rebukes Saul for his wrongdoing, verses 8 through 15a. Fourth, the Israelites and the Philistine army confront each other, verses 15b through 23. Read verses 1 through 2. Saul was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned over Israel 42 years. Saul chose 3,000 men from Israel. 2,000 were with him at Michmash and in the hill country of Bethel, and 8,000 were with Jonathan at Gibeah in Benjamin. The rest of the men he sent back to their homes. It was now about 2 years after Saul became king. Saul went into battle with the Philistines. Here it says that 3,000 men from Israel went to battle. Verse 3. Jonathan attacked the Philistine outpost at Geba, and the Philistines heard about it. Then Saul had the trumpet blown throughout the land, and said, "Let the Hebrews hear." Jonathan attacked the Philistine outpost. Because of this, the Philistines wanted to invade Israel. King Saul then prepared to go into battle against the Philistines. It was wrong of Jonathan to attack the Philistines. Israel was God's nation. It was a nation that was under God's reign. Therefore it was wicked of foreign powers to invade God's nation. Hence Jonathan courageously went and fought with faith and justice. Jonathan attacked the Philistine outpost with a loving heart for God. The number of soldiers does not determine the outcome of battle. The Lord's salvation is not determined by the number of people. Chapter 14, verse 6. God works for the believers. God personally saves us. Therefore, we must courageously fight the good fight as Jonathan did. Chapter 17, verse 47. Verse 15, verse 5. The Philistines assembled to fight Israel with 3,000 chariots, 6,000 charioteers, and soldiers as numerous as the sand on the seashore. They went up and camped at Michmash, east of Beth Aven. The Philistines had a great military force. The Philistines had 3,000 chariots. They had 6,000 charioteers. They had soldiers as numerous as the sand on the seashore. They were armed with the latest weapons of the time. However, the Israelite army consisted of only a few thousand soldiers. The Israelites did not have many weapons. They were small in number. Still, the Israelites were to trust in God's power and fight the good fight. Verse 6. When the men of Israel saw that their situation was critical and that their army was hard-pressed, they hid in caves and thickets, among the rocks, and in pits and cisterns. The Israelites cowardly ran away. The Israelites ran away because they were afraid of the Philistine army. The Israelites did not have faith in God. Verse 8. He waited 7 days, the time set by Samuel, but Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and Saul's men began to scatter. Verse 9. So he said, "Bring me the burnt offering and the fellowship offerings." and Saul offered up the burnt offering. The enemy was strong. The Israelites were afraid and ran away. Samuel also did not come at the set time. Saul then gave the burnt offering and fellowship offerings to God. Samuel arrived right after Saul offered the burnt offering. Samuel then rebuked King Saul. Saul did wrong. Certainly they were in an unfortunate situation. Samuel did not come. The enemy was strong. The Israelites had scattered. Thus Saul said he felt compelled to offer the burnt offering. This was an excuse. When we wait, we must wait until the end. When we obey, we must obey until the end. We must wait until the last moment. Saul was wrong in giving the burnt offering himself. Only the Levites could become priests, and only the Levites could give offerings to God. Numbers chapter 3, verses 5 through 10. Thus Saul could not act as priest because he was from the tribe of Benjamin. We must always obey God's word, whether it is difficult for us to obey or not. We must not compromise God's word in whatever circumstance. The prophet Samuel strictly reprimanded King Saul for his foolishness. Saul's authority as king would be taken away from him because he disobeyed God's command. King Saul violated God's holiness. Saul crossed over the boundary into God's holiness. We must live by faith according to the Bible. We must go just until where the Bible allows. We must not simply charge forward. We must live by the truth. King Uzziah was afflicted with leprosy because he attempted to give an offering in place of the priest. 2 Chronicles chapter 26, verse 19. When we give offerings to God, we must give offerings in spirit and in truth. Saul disobeyed, which means that he did not fear God. He disregarded God's word. We must give true sacrifices and worship to God. We must fear God and worship with faith. Verse 16. Saul and his son Jonathan and the men with them were staying in Gibeah in Benjamin, while the Philistines camped at Michmash. There were about 600 men who were with Saul. Many had run away, and there was just a few number left. Saul and Jonathan were the only ones who had a sword and a spear. However, the Philistine army was a very powerful army. It would be difficult for Saul's army to fight against the Philistine army. Yet what is important is that we can win with the power of God. We must not only look at the enemy's strengths. We must believe that God's power is with us. We must remember that David defeated Goliath with God's power. We will continue with 1 Samuel chapter 14. The title is Jonathan and Saul's Victory. Let's look at the main points. First, Jonathan attacks the Philistine army, verses 1 through 15. Second, Jonathan's victory, verses 16 through 23. Third, the Israelites become exhausted, verses 24 through 35. Fourth, Saul intends to punish Jonathan, verses 36 through 44. Fifth, the people rescue Jonathan, verses 45 through 46. Sixth, Saul's victory, verses 47 through 52. Read verses 1 through 2. One day Jonathan, son of Saul, said to the young man bearing his armor, "Come, let's go over to the Philistine outpost on the other side." But he did not tell his father. Saul was staying on the outskirts of Gibeah under a pomegranate tree in Migron. With him were about 600 men. The Israelite army and the Philistine army came near each other. The Philistine outpost was on the other side of the Israelite army. One day Jonathan said to the young man bearing his armor, "Let's go over to the Philistines' side." At that time, Saul was staying on the outskirts of Gibeah. Saul only had 600 men with him. A man named Ahijah, wearing an ephod, was with him. Verse 3. Among whom was Ahijah, who was wearing an ephod? He was a son of Ichabod's brother Ahitub, son of Phinehas, the son of Eli, the Lord's priest in Shiloh. No one was aware that Jonathan had left. Ahijah was wearing an ephod. Ahijah was Ichabod's brother. He was the great-grandson of Eli the priest. It is possible that Saul appointed Ahijah as priest. Verse 4. On each side of the pass that Jonathan intended to cross to reach the Philistine outpost was a cliff. One was called Bozez and the other Seneh. Jonathan wanted to cross over to the Philistine outpost, yet there was a cliff. One was called Bozez and the other was called Seneh. Verse 6. Jonathan said to his young armor-bearer, "Come, let's go over to the outpost of those uncircumcised fellows. Perhaps the Lord will act in our behalf. Nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few." Jonathan displayed his faith here. The number of the Philistine army was as many as the sand on the seashore. Chapter 12, verse 5. Yet Jonathan was not afraid. Nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few. Salvation is in God's hands. Jonathan believed in God's power. Jonathan believed that the two of them could defeat the enemy if God was with them. We could see that the young armor-bearer also had good faith. Hence, Jonathan and the armor-bearer invaded the Philistine outpost. Verses 8 through 9. Jonathan said, "Come then, we will cross over toward the men and let them see us. If they say to us, 'Wait there until we come to you,' we will stay where we are and not go up to them." Jonathan and his armor-bearer entered the Philistine boundary. Then Jonathan decided to test something. If the Philistine men saw Jonathan, and if they said, "Wait," Jonathan would not go up to them. However, if the Philistine men said, "Come up," it would be a sign from God for the two of them to invade. Verse 12. The men of the outpost shouted to Jonathan and his armor-bearer, "Come up to us and we'll teach you a lesson." So Jonathan said to his armor-bearer, "Climb up after me. The Lord has given them into the hand of Israel." Jonathan showed himself to the Philistine outpost. The Philistine men then said, "Come up to us." Jonathan then knew that it was God's will. Jonathan decided to go up and fight the Philistines. Jonathan said, "The Lord has given them into the hand of Israel." Verses 13 through 14. Jonathan climbed up using his hands and feet, with his armor-bearer right behind him. The Philistines fell before Jonathan, and his armor-bearer right behind him. The Philistines fell before Jonathan, and his armor-bearer followed and killed behind him. In that first attack, Jonathan and his armor-bearer killed some 20 men in an area of about half an acre. Jonathan and his armor-bearer climbed up. Then Jonathan struck the Philistine army. The Philistines fell before Jonathan. Jonathan and his armor-bearer killed about 20 men in an area of about half an acre. Half an acre was an area of land that could be plowed by a yoke of oxen in one day. The two men killed 20 people. Jonathan laid down his life with faith and relied on God as he fought. The power of God helped Jonathan. Hence, Jonathan gained victory. Verse 16. Saul's lookouts at Gibeah in Benjamin saw the army melting away in all directions. Saul's lookouts in Benjamin saw the Philistines. They saw that the Philistines were scattering in all directions. In verse 17, King Saul said, "Muster the forces and see who has left us." Then they found that Jonathan and his armor-bearer were not there. Verse 20. Then Saul and all his men assembled and went to the battle. They found the Philistines in total confusion, striking each other with their swords. The Philistines struck each other with their swords. The Philistines were in total confusion. This was God's work, and God made the Philistines' eyes grow dark. The Philistines thought that their own men were their enemy's army, and they killed each other. The Philistines were in total confusion. God worked and allowed Jonathan to gain victory. Verse 21. Those Hebrews who had previously been with the Philistines and had gone up with them to their camp went over to the Philistines, went over to the Israelites who were with Saul and Jonathan. At that time there were Hebrews who were living in the Philistine land. The Hebrews were chosen as soldiers in the Philistine army. The Philistines began to retreat. The Israelites in the Philistine army returned. They planned a revolt against the Philistines. Verse 22. When all the Israelites who had hidden in the hill country of Ephraim heard that the Philistines were on the run, they joined the battle in hot pursuit. Those who had hidden in the hill country of Ephraim came out of hiding. They were men who previously ran away because they were afraid. Now these men came out of hiding. Hence the Israelites gained victory in the battle. Now let's look at the cause of victory in the battle. First, Jonathan believed in God's power and went courageously to fight. Second, God made the enemy greatly afraid. Third, the Philistines fought and killed each other. Fourth, the Hebrews in the Philistine land returned. The Hebrews struck the Philistine army. Fifth, the men who had hidden in the hill country of Ephraim joined the battle. Hence the Israelites gained a great victory. We too must go forward with courageous faith like that of Jonathan. We must not be afraid, but lay down our lives and fight for God's works. We must not fight with flesh and blood. We do not fight with our fists or with swords. We fight the spiritual fight. We must win with the truth and with God's word. Then God will allow us to have victory. Here we will conclude the 5th lecture on 1 Samuel. Thank you.